I'm Bronya Galef, member of the Board of Overseers of the Museum, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's Hammer Forum on Strategies for Fostering Bipartisanship and Cooperation in Washington Politics. It's a big subject. With Lanny Davis and Michael Steele, moderated by Ian Masters. Ian is a BBC-trained broadcast journalist who's covered national security affairs for over 25 years on public radio. He's the host of Background Briefing, which can be heard Sundays from 11 till noon, and Daily Briefing Mondays through Thursdays at 5 p.m. on KPFK 90.7. Sorry. Ian has been a senior at UCLA Center for Strategic and International Affairs and UCLA Center for International Relations. He was a consultant to the Center for National Security Studies at Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Ian Masters.
Thank you, Bronya, and all of you for coming tonight in search of the shrinking center, the independents, the swing voters who used to dominate our politics that now have become more polarized as Washington grinds to a halt with rancor and gridlock. And while we are mostly focused on the presidential horse race, an avalanche of super PAC money is pouring into state, congressional, and Senate races. So if an Obama victory is to happen, it is likely to be bittersweet, as his second term will probably be mired in even more remorseless gridlock in a divided government with dogged partisanship focused on the next election, not the needs of the American people. How did it get this way? Well, blame it on the 24-hour cable news, on partisan redistricting that has led to permanent tenure for congressmen on both sides in safe seats that have less turnover than the rubber stamp apparatchiks of the Supreme Soviet of the late USSR. Then there is the mainstream media's slavish devotion to balance, as if in the universe of ideas there are only two black and white equal and opposite arguments, with the ritual fair and balanced thesis, antithesis, synthesis coverage of pro, then con, then a meaningless mush. This has led to creationism being equated with evolution and denial of science as the other side of the reality of global warming. With truth a moving target, and he who best spins, manipulates, and manages the truth the winner, we are becoming a society and culture without a consensus on what is true anymore. Atomized tribes lost in a fact-free zone of reality shopping, where liberals get their news from MSNBC, conservatives theirs from Fox News, and Christians their information from Christian TV and radio. Finally, perhaps the biggest change has been the abandonment of a tradition that when one side loses an election, they go off and lick their wounds, then come back 4 years later with new ideas and a better candidate. That changed under Clinton when his ability to govern was frustrated from day one by an orchestrated effort to tie him up in subpoenas with a legalistic fishing expedition that finally hauled in Monica Lewinsky and led to his impeachment. This new scorched earth tactic has, if anything, intensified under Obama. Yet the conventional wisdom persists that America has always been a centrist country in which the two parties go through the ritual of appealing to their base in the primaries, then gravitating back to the center for the general. The assumption being that the sensible center decides once the partisan polls have had their say. Yet following Republican primaries, where some of their most respected centrist elder statesmen, like Senator Lugar, have been unceremoniously tossed out, things appear to be different. This time the GOP is not courting the center, as the party still hugs the hard right, even on the home stretch. Meanwhile, the Democrats seem to have the opposite problem. They've already won the center, but their challenge is to inspire their partisan base, who feel left out in the ideological wilderness by broken promises of hope and change. If those who voted for Obama in 2008 were ready to show up again in 2012, this year's election would be a walk, not the close competition most pundits expect. But the enthusiasm gap is palpable, with fired-up take-no-prisoner partisans on the right and a pouting and petulant left that feels betrayed by the miracle worker who turned out to be mortal. Angry at Obama's excessive accommodation towards his tormentors who plotted his downfall on the day he was inaugurated. And while those who rallied to hope and change perhaps did not know Obama was a centrist at heart, they don't understand why he gave Wall Street a blank check while the Tea Party ran away with the popular outrage over bailouts. Conversely, the Republicans have their best president since Nixon, yet they are so riled up and blinded by hateful delusions that they don't know it. They've invented this socialist imposter who wants their guns and hates their God. But in the real world, Nixon was probably to the left of Obama, and Nixon would have gone for single-payer health care, not Obamacare, had he not had that little problem with the plumbers. Although, to be fair, since the 1970s, the country has clearly moved further and further to the right. So to my mind, we now have mutually assured delusions, a right wing feeding off a fictional nemesis who is presiding over an economy where the richest of the rich have never had it so good, with record corporate profits and cash on hand and a booming stock market, and a left wing who thought they were getting a youthful FDR and a New Deal, but instead got a cautious consensus seeker who in his first test of leadership reached out to the other side to help in rescuing the economy with an insufficient stimulus that the Republicans diluted by 40% with tax cuts, then didn't give him even one vote. And now they are hanging the stalled economy around his neck, running a campaign right out of James Carville's old playbook, "It's the economy, stupid." So if you are feeling blue about being blue, or you're red-faced about being red, enter the Purple Men, our guests tonight. Lenny Davis will speak first for 15 minutes, followed by Michael Steele. Then we'll have a conversation, followed by extensive Q&A. Lenny Davis is a well-known legal crisis management expert, lawyer, and communicator with decades of experience. He has served in numerous roles, most significantly as former White House special counsel to President Clinton. Beyond legal and crisis management work, he is the co-founder of the public affairs firm Purple Nation Solutions, founded with Michael Steele. He served as special counsel to President Bill Clinton from 1996 to 1998, prior to serving on the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board for President George W. Bush. Ladies and gentlemen, Lenny Davis.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ian. That was a very articulate message. And while you mentioned MSNBC and Fox, you didn't mention where you can really go to find the truth, which is National Public Radio. And as an NPR addict, I've now discovered Ian. I'm going to be a loyal listener. So I'd like to talk about the great center of American politics. And while I agree with a lot of what Ian said, I'm a little bit more hopeful that there is going to emerge a great center from the ashes of this polarization that I find so depressing. I do find that there's greater anger towards what I have to say among my fellow liberals than among conservatives. When I'm at airports, I actually, to the extent that people who don't have a life are watching cable television and seeing me, they come up to me and usually say, "I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative. I appreciate the fact that you seem to be at least open-minded and try to be fair." So I get those kinds of compliments. I'm always highly complimented when anyone says that to me, and I always thank them. But I rarely get a Democrat, especially a liberal Democrat, saying anything to me other than terrible hate mail and terrible tweets and terrible internet and anonymous hate. And I find it's the hatred of the person who thinks you've betrayed them because you're on their side, less than they feel betrayed by somebody on the way other side. So there's a human nature reality to the hatred you get when you're on your side versus the other side. And I think you'll hear Michael Steele tell you similar comments when he was in the position he was in, where a lot of the haters that he faced were people he mostly agreed with as a Republican, but nevertheless they accused him of being disloyal or being a traitor because he didn't always agree with the orthodoxy. So being in a position where on every major issue I can think of, I'm by any measure a liberal, I am still in the position that President Clinton used to describe when he tried to find a third way to create a broader electoral map than up to 1992, the Democratic Party didn't have any kind of electoral map. In fact, as we enter the 92 presidential campaign, the generally understood fact is the Democrats could win the Congress, but there was no way they could win the presidency. They had lost 5 out of 6. We had lost 5 out of 6 presidential elections by landslides. If you start with 1972 and take out Jimmy Carter as a post-Watergate aberration, 1980 Reagan, 1984 Reagan, 1988 George H.W. Bush against Dukakis, you're looking at landslides, not just the 68 election was a narrow win by Richard Nixon. So what President Clinton did and what I wanted to talk about tonight is it possible to call yourself a centrist while being a liberal or a conservative? And I would submit to you, for purposes of maybe provoking a discussion, that it not only is possible to maintain your principles as a liberal or as a conservative and still be a centrist in terms of getting a solution. And President Clinton used to say, the middle of the road is where the roadkill is, because you are caught in a crossfire between the sharp ideologies of the left and the right when you try to seek the center, not by giving up your principles, but by willing to find a spot somewhere, not necessarily between the left and the right poles, but maybe out into what, again, I'll refer to my old friend Bill Clinton, a third way, a solution that might not be splitting the difference between left and right. That's what I call the new center. Ian mentioned the illness of our culture today, where sometimes we aren't driven by facts to reach conclusions. We're driven by emotion, ideology, theology, which is somehow substituted for fact-based analysis that leads to a conclusion based on facts, climate warming being the obvious example. So if we look at an ideology, my liberalism comes from my father. I have an ideology that says government should help people less well off, and if you're wealthy, you should be taxed at a higher rate to give people an opportunity who are less well off than you are. That's ideological. That's a matter of faith, of philosophy, of values. I would say a conservative who I respect would say exactly the same goal. Jack Kemp is a great example. Exactly the same goal as I have: help minorities, help the poor, help people who have less opportunity. But you, Mr. Davis, have the wrong pathway to help the poor. You want to use government, which is inefficient, expensive, bureaucratic, and doesn't deliver the results that poor people need. The marketplace that creates jobs, opportunities, upward mobility is the conservative principles that lead to the same result. Now, Jack Kemp and I would probably be, as we were, very close friends before he passed away, and we would probably end up saying, okay, sometimes the marketplace works, leave it alone, let it blossom, but sometimes you need a social safety net called government to catch people who are down and out and living on the streets. And somewhere between those two choices of methods to get to the same result, there's a mixture. Sometimes it's to the left, sometimes it's to the right. Sometimes it's more government, sometimes it's less government. A great Democratic president named President Clinton used the expression, the era of big government is over. Ronald Reagan grew the federal government at a higher rate than any president before him and grew deficits at a higher rate than any president before him. He was a conservative. President Clinton and Vice President Gore reduced the number of federal employees in the 8 years they were there, and President Clinton started out with a $300 billion deficit. Sounded like a lot of money in those days. And ended up with a $1 trillion surplus that was in the bank for Social Security and Medicare. So did that make Clinton left, right, or did he work with Newt Gingrich and reform welfare, balance the budget, and produce economic growth and 23 million jobs? So I'm a believer in the Clinton way, which laid the roadmap for what Barack Obama then did himself, which is to carry forward a strategy where we could win in states that before 1992 had been written off as unwinnable by Democrats. And that includes now border states. Bill Clinton won in Georgia, a lot of people forget, Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and we also won in the Rocky Mountain states, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, places that before 1992 no Democrat even touched down their airplanes. Michael Dukakis and even Al Gore flew over most of the country, go from East Coast to the West Coast, never even looked down at Colorado. So we Democrats need to break out of our core principles only insofar as we're willing to listen to the other side and find some sweet spot where there are solutions to solve people's problems. 70% is better than 0% if you're poor and down and out. And my best example of that is when I debated Howard Dean once. It was on MSNBC before I joined Fox, when I was allowed to be on MSNBC. And we were debating President Obama's Affordable Care Act, which the Republicans renamed Obamacare. And it was a debate about how do we get to home plate to get national health care finally. Since Harry Truman, we've wanted to get there as a party and have never made it. The only Western democracy in the world that didn't guarantee access to health care other than income. And we were close, but we needed that 60 votes in the Senate to be able to prevail, since no Republican was going to support this bill. And it came down to 57, 58, 59, maybe 60 votes if we gave up the public option, meaning a government-run health insurance plan that people could choose if the private insurance market wasn't producing a policy that people could afford. Well, I was in favor of the public option because I thought it would create more competition for private insurance companies. I actually am to the left of even that concept. I would have favored Medicare for all, a single-payer system where government is guaranteeing everybody's health care. That sort of makes me a socialist, I guess, just on this issue. But that was my dad, really, who believed that there are certain basics of life that everybody should have as a right of citizenship, and health care and a roof over your head and food on the table he believed in. He also believed in private enterprise because he was a dentist, so. But my point is the public option was never going to get passed because we couldn't get 60, and that was the number. And I heard Howard Dean one night and Al Sharpton and a bunch of other people on MSNBC yelling at me because I was ready to sell out on the public option. And we shouldn't sell out. And Howard said, and I know he didn't mean it, but he said it, I'd rather not have this bill if we're going to give up the public option. And I couldn't help myself. I was in a studio in Washington, and he was, I think, somewhere in New Jersey or New York. And I said, Governor Dean, do you have health insurance right now as you speak? And he got a little bit irritated with me, and he said, yes, what about it? And I said, I'll doubt that anybody watching who can't afford health insurance, who's worried about their children getting sick and going to the emergency rooms to get care, is going to say, I'd rather not have this bill passed that gives me guaranteed access to health care unless there's a public option. I'll bet you the only people who say that are people who have health insurance. So I was very much criticized for that position, but it turned out Barack Obama had the same position because he counted to 60 the same way that I did. And we got it done. President Obama got it done. There's a genuine debate on whether it's the right solution, but I would suggest that it does represent what I call the new center, because Barack Obama, despite Ian's aspersions that he maybe isn't delivering what he promised, and I think there's a lot of truth to that, was willing to get 70% rather than 100%. So we got poor people and people who couldn't afford insurance finally, after all these years, now have guaranteed access to health care. And the 85% of the American people who already have health insurance, because there are only 15%, about 30 million people don't, never have to go to bed again and worry about their health insurance being canceled because they lose their jobs or they have pre-existing conditions. But that health care bill, to me, is not a radical socialist bill. It's quite to the contrary. It's entirely based on private insurance companies competing on what are called health care exchanges. And that concept of private insurance companies being forced to compete with people being subsidized who are below a certain level of income because they can't afford the premiums, so there are tax subsidies to help them. That concept was invented in the 1990s by the Cato Institute in Washington, one of the most conservative free market organizations in Washington, D.C. And it was supported by the Republicans throughout the 90s, and it was enacted in the state of Massachusetts by Mitt Romney. So there is a center. It does exist somewhere, and all of us who have strongly held ideologies and strongly held values from our parents, from our experiences, wherever we get values from, need to search for that center. That's why Michael Steele and I got together to form what we call a Purple Nation Solution Company, where we can be liberal and conservative, listen to each other, listen to clients who have problems, and try to find that consensus position where solutions are somewhere either between the left and the right or somewhere out there in the third way that President Clinton loved to look for. Thank you for listening.
Michael Steele is an American politician who served as the first African-American chairman of the Republican National Committee from January 2009 until January 2011. From 2003 to 2007, he was the 7th Lieutenant Governor of Maryland and the first African-American elected to statewide office in Maryland. During his time as Lieutenant Governor, he chaired the Minority Business Enterprise Task Force, actively promoting an expansion of affirmative action in the corporate world, and he's now a columnist for the online magazine The Root and is a commentator on MSNBC. Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Steele.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be back in California and to hang out with my buddy and my partner, Lanny Davis. I've learned a lot in my association with Lanny. I don't agree with anything he generally says when he opens his mouth. You know, there's wrong and then there's dead wrong, but that's what makes this partnership work. And I think it speaks to a new way for politics. And I certainly appreciate Ian and certainly the opportunity to be here with all of you, with whom I don't know where you are on the political spectrum, and quite frankly, I don't give a damn where you are on the political spectrum. But what I am more interested in is having a dialogue, a conversation, an exchange of ideas in which we can debate civilly and, more importantly, towards that consensus. And I really appreciate that you're using that word as you set up this conversation, because Washington is built on the idea of bipartisanship. So can I disabuse you of the notion of the fiction of bipartisanship? It does not exist. in any real world scenario. It is a political fiction. It is designed to make you think something is being done. It is designed to make you feel like those that you've elected are actually listening and care about what is important to you. And I'm here as a native Washingtonian who grew up, spent my entire life in the nation's capital. I grew up in Petworth of Washington, D.C. National politics is my local politics, and I can tell you it is one of the biggest lies perpetrated on the public in a long, long time, because it fills a particular agenda. Part of my challenge as national chairman was going into that environment with a level of honesty that was not necessarily appreciated by my colleagues on the right. I am a very conservative individual. I was raised in a Democrat household, but when I told her that I had decided to become a Republican, she said, "Lord, baby, what's wrong?" How did that happen? My mother will appreciate that very much. And she said, "How did you become a Republican?" I just said, "You raised me well." And she did. And she did. And don't hiss my mother now. She did raise me well, because she raised me to be a free thinker. She raised me to make my own decision and to come at my politics in an honest and open way on my terms, not on hers. Just because she was a Roosevelt Democrat and I had the choice of being what I wanted to be. And I say that very freely and very openly. You know, my roots as a Republican is based in libertarianism. And I believe fundamentally you have a path and a choice that you can make. That's been the root of the party. One of my frustrations with the modern Republican Party is it seems to have forgotten those roots. And so part of the challenge in today's environment, going back to that idea of bipartisanship, is sort of setting that aside and recognizing that the real challenge and the real opportunity lies in building consensus. Because consensus doesn't say you can't believe what you believe. Consensus doesn't say that those firmly held values that your mama and your daddy raised you on don't matter or matter more than others. What it says is that's where you start. And if you're in elected office in particular, the goal is to find that point where your service to the people matters more than your own personal and individual privilege, right, or whatever you want to call it, that you have as an elected official. And a lot of folks in town, and even in our state capitals, whether it's Sacramento or Annapolis in Maryland, have lost sight of that underlying reality of leadership. And so the frustration for me, whether it was as Lieutenant Governor of Maryland or as National Chairman for the Republican Committee, was seeing the devolution of the responsibility of leadership, where we use these terms and we throw out this language that doesn't bring us together, that doesn't require the liberal thinker and the conservative thinker, the libertarian thinker, the socialist thinker, to come to terms with the realities that we all have to face and find that sweet spot, that point where we can all agree that we're willing to sacrifice for the better good. And that is a very different conversation than you've heard, certainly in the Republican Party in the last 10 years or so. And I would submit even at times within the Democratic Party, that we fall on and rely a lot on the partisan shtick to accomplish a very short-sighted and limited goal, and that's re-election. If our leaders ran and then won, but then put that aside and governed, then we'd have a very different climate and environment. And part of what Lanny and I decided to do, and I'll never forget the phone call when he said, "Look, I've got this crazy idea, and I thought of you," which I'm like, okay, that works. You know, that we probably can craft a new way to create a new dialogue. You know, there are very strong values and conservative ideas that I hold true to. And there are very strong values and liberal ideas that he holds to. But he and I both believed that in the national conversation that we must have, that those values can help forge a new strategy, a new opportunity. And let me give you, from a policy standpoint, a good example of what I'm talking about, just so you don't think I'm really out there on a limb. Simpson Bowles, where you had, in that one brief shining moment on Capitol Hill, very strong conservatives and very strong liberals in the Senate and in the House come together around an idea, building a consensus towards creating a pathway to solving the economic problems that we have. Legitimate effort. Legitimate effort. What was the problem? The president didn't support it, and Republicans blocked it. Why? Because it did not fit into the Washington scheme or strategy, political strategy. The president was basically forced down by whatever was going on in the White House, and certainly by those outside. And Republicans were pushed by its base to block any action that would move towards resolution, towards consensus. That's the politics that we want now. When we have families that are hurting, individuals who have lost jobs, have been unemployed for 18 or so months. And as I look at a young woman that I had a conversation a few weeks ago on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, who is unemployed now for some 18 months, 2 kids living in her car. So what the heck what are we going to do about that? What is Obama and what is Romney? What is Ryan? What is Biden? What are the leadership of our political system going to do about that one person? Now multiply that number. Multiply her scenario, her plight. And that's the frustration that we see right now in politics. As national chairman, I got the whole political thing. You know, you got to go out there, you got to beat the drum, you got to do the rah-rah, you got to move your base, you got to win elections. My job was very simple. Raise money, win elections, and I was pretty damn good at that. 198 million took back to Congress, grabbed some state legislatures along the way, won some governorships. So I did that right, but I learned a lot in that process as well. And what I learned was that in that march towards winning, you have to listen. And the people will tell you how to lead, what their expectations are. And my frustration, not as a conservative, not as a Republican, but as an American, is that our leadership has stopped listening. And so what we're trying to do is forge a different kind of dialogue where you can beat me up all day long on health care. I think Lanny's view on health care is a little bit whack, as we say in my neighborhood. Okay? And that's fine. That's fine. So now let's debate that. So if we go from his position to my position on it, where do we meet so that we can actually solve the problem of 30 million people who don't have insurance? That we can actually put in check an insurance industry that's run amok? That we can actually bring some certainty to employers who are facing a future of increased health care costs? How do we begin to build that new platform? My supposition, my reality is it rests with you here on the West Coast, on the East Coast, in the middle of the country, all of us kind of pushing this leadership to listening to what we want and having the big battles, having the big discussions, but doing so with the core objective that we actually get something done. And so as I look at the debates that are coming up, and I know we'll talk a little bit about this political season and what it really means and what it boils down to, but I really want to set the stage for that part of the conversation with this final point. When we're looking at the debates that are coming up, which is where the heart and soul of this campaign will be fought and ultimately won, what is your expectation when Barack Obama stands up on that stage and when Mitt Romney stands up on that stage and talks to you? But more importantly, what will you do and what are you prepared to do when you don't hear them respond to your questions? When you have the same lies and platitudes, when you have third-party organizations running stupid, banal commercials that are full of crap, that pollute the political system, that creates the mistrust and distrust that brews in your stomach, what is your expectation going to be? Are you going to acquiesce and just be another pawn in this process, or are you really going to stand up and say something that pushes these two individuals to actually start to solve the problem. At the end of the day, and I've said this to the Romney team many times, to the extent that they want to listen, I'll say it again, that you will not be able to convince the American people that the only thing you can do is cut taxes. You're not going to be able to convince the American people that the only thing you can do is to carve out this portion over here and focus on this segment, and carve out this portion over here and focus on this segment. You're going to have to look at the entire puzzle, and you have to put all in. And you're going to have to explain and express in an honest way what's going to be required and what the sacrifices really mean and what the costs are. Because people aren't stupid. They understand fundamentally that these are tough times, but they're looking for the leadership that helps them carve out exactly what that means. And the same is true for Barack Obama. And so everything that Lanny said, whether it was on health care or how we come to this table, really is sort of the beginnings, I think, of a new opportunity for a conversation. We don't have to wait until after the election to have it. We don't have to wait until we get to that cliff. And I know some on the left and the right really want us to get to that economic cliff. Well, you know what? I don't like cliffs. And if I can avoid them, then why wouldn't I? Why would I jump headlong into the abyss not knowing exactly how far down I have to go or will go, or how hard I will land? Why would I do that when I know I can come to a full stop, reverse course, and do something different? And that's where we are right now, folks. That's where we are. And so for me, this, the challenges of my party as we have built a wall in some cases that, quite frankly, I worked very hard as national chairman to tear down, to expand the reach and the breadth of the party. We're rebuilding that wall. We've always been, for example, on immigration, the party that's talked about assimilation. Now we're talking about, fences and walls and, locking doors and keeping people out. And look, I'm all for law and order and the rule of law, and you come through the right checkpoint. But my heavens, there's a way in which we can have this conversation that is sensitive to the fact that we're talking about human beings, we're talking about families, and we're talking about people who followed a dream. And sure, we can argue and maybe have a problem with how they came here, but now that they're here, what do? And we don't want to be the party that says, get out. We want to be the party that says, let's work it out. And so these are some of the challenges that I know I try to bring to the conversation as a former national chairman, as someone in the party. And there are a lot of folks who feel like I do. But as we saw in the Republican primary, if you're the governor of Texas, a border state, who has a solution that works in his state, it's a problem with translation with some folks in the party. And it doesn't work to your political advantage to be that honest. Well, it's about time you be that honest, because it's the only way the change is going to come. And I push it back to all of us. How honest are we willing to be in our conversations with our leaders to make sure they get it right? So, these are exciting times, Ian, and I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. Hopefully set the stage for what will be some very interesting questions and hopefully some provocative answers.
If you don't mind a little levity, I'd like to tell a story about a parent saying to a child, be independent, as Mama said to Michael. When my son, who was raised in a house with the Clintons as longtime friends, called me. He's now a television star for CBS and does the NCAA tournament, basketball tournament with Greg Gumbel and Charles Barkley. His name is Seth Davis. I don't look like him because he's very good looking. And he's become very famous during the Final Four on CBS, and called me in 2008 to tell me, Dad, I'm about to be publicly announced by CBS as endorsing Barack Obama. I said, what? You can't do that. You know how close we are to the Clintons, and I went to school with Hillary. You can't do that, Seth. And he said, Dad, as your mother heard you say, you always taught me to think for myself and be independent. I said, okay, All I ask is, let me see if I can get a hold of Hillary so I can let her know so she doesn't hear it on the news. So I tried calling Senator Clinton while she was out campaigning, and I couldn't get to her. And next thing I know, a reporter's calling me that CBS put him up to, saying, hey, I heard your son's about to endorse Hillary Clinton. I thought I'd get a little father-son debate going on here. So I didn't want to get into an argument with somebody I love with all my heart, and he's a great son. But I had to do something just to prove that if he wants to, I can't do sports as well as he do, but I'm a good spin meister, right? So I felt challenged, I got to do this right. Because he'd already put his statement out that Barack Obama speaks to my generation. I admire Senator Clinton, but I'm for Barack Obama. That was his statement. I figured I have to come up with something. So this is probably something I'd like you to tell your mom. So I was very careful. How am I going to do this? I want to love my son, but I want to win this contest, father-son. So I wrote out a sentence, and I edited it, and I thought about it, and I said, I got it right. And so the next morning, it was published. And Seth called me and said, Dad, my hat's off. You won this one. And then Senator Clinton called and said, I heard about Seth. And I said, I'm so sorry, Hillary. Don't worry about it. It's happened to all my friends. So here was the sentence. And she said, that was a perfect quote. Everybody's calling me about your quote. The sentence was, I've always told my son, Seth, to think for himself, to be independent, and not to allow his father to influence his politics, period. Next sentence. I just didn't think he would take me literally. So,
It's true.
sorry. Had to tell you that story.
So I know the discussions about the battle between the parties, the fighting to a standstill and gridlock, but you brought up something that fascinates me, and something that I've observed, Lanny, is because I spend most of my time with people on the left, and that is that Democrats reserve most of their animus towards those Democrats that are slightly to the right of them.
Yeah.
And it's quite, and they give Republicans a free pass in effect.
Yeah.
And it's a strange pathology, and it's quite pervasive. Does that exist on the right?
Oh my goodness, yes. Didn't you read about my 2 years as chairman?
I've heard about rhinos, but tell us about it.
Well, but I hate that term rhino. It just drives me absolutely through the floor because it's such an ignorant characterization of someone. And the same with Dino or whatever they call, Democrats who aren't part of the orthodoxy. But yeah, I mean, my 2 years as chairman was riddled with a lot of crazy stuff coming from my own. In fact, it was funny. I have some mutual friends who work some friends who work in the Obama administration, and they told me. This was like maybe 6 months after I'd become chairman, and it's like this endless barrage of stuff about me. And they said, we had a meeting here at the White House, and it was decided that the administration and Democrats would not come after you because your side is doing a perfectly good job of it. And it was true. If you go back and look, you rarely saw anything from the left or from the DNC. Tim Kaine, Chairman Kaine, was a buddy. We worked very well together on a number of issues that were important to both parties. But it rarely came that way. And it is something about within your own family. Those who decide that you are not orthodox enough or pure enough on given issues, whether it's abortion, which I thought was ironic. When I was running for chairman, I had attacks from my right on the question of abortion. And I had to take several members aside and point out to them that I was a monk, for heaven's sakes. So my position on life, I think, is pretty square with the Catholic Church. So to sit there and say that I'm not pro-life enough is just ignorant and stupid. But that's what they do. They found these ways to sort of make this push back because you never expressed it or did not express it the way they wanted you to express it. And as I would point out to folks, my views on life, for example, come from the fact that I was adopted. So I really do appreciate that that idea of choice, because my mother, back in the 1950s, living in a very different time, under very difficult circumstances, came around to a choice that I thank her for, quite frankly, but also recognize how difficult and important that is for a lot of people. But to express that openly within the party was heresy, because there's an orthodoxy that settled in that any other expression other than that, defined by whomever, I don't even know who these people, I like to get in the room with these people when they have these discussions, becomes problematic. So both sides kind of have to deal with that. Lanny gets it a lot, as he noted, from some on the left who feel that the way he expresses his liberalism or his views on an issue from a liberal perspective doesn't fit a particular orthodoxy. It doesn't mean he's less liberal. It's just that he's recognizing and expressing, as I recognize and expressing from a conservative side, that you don't want to come at where I'm going to beat you up and make you feel threatened by what I'm saying. But the idea is to lay out an argument for you to hear it and not be turned off by it, and then you can decide for yourself whether you agree with it. Again, I don't really care. But the idea that I'm able to express it and put that seed in your head one way or the other, for me is very important. And I hate it when you have this lockdown. Look, when I was chairman, I had to beat back people who at one of our meetings, they started a petition to set up litmus tests to decide who could be a Republican. And I said, hell no, that's not happening on my watch. There's no way I'm going to be chairman of a party where you stand at a door with a clipboard and have people check off whether or not they fit a particular point of view. And that goes back to what I was saying about how the party is excluding itself from the public arena by setting up these straw dog arguments and these false premises for joining the party. I had none of that at 17 when I became a Republican. What moved me towards the party was an appreciation of its history, appreciation of its efforts, and the leadership at that time, whether it was a Ronald Reagan or some other leaders at the time, who inspired in me something that I could relate to. It's that simple, So it's a very challenging reality today.
So we did a forum a while back with a couple of political operatives who run campaigns. Dan Schnur, who ran McCain's 2008 campaign, and Bill Zimmerman, who's run a bunch of campaigns on the Democratic side. And one of the things that was most depressing about the conversation was that they talked that it's so much about money and how you spend money, and we're seeing unprecedented amounts of money pour in. But the long and the short of it is, you wouldn't know there's an election going on here in California. All the money is concentrated in the swing states. Mm-hmm. So only 20% of Americans are involved in an election.
Right.
Then on top of that, this is what it really got me, was that towards the end of the election, say in October, then they go after the undecideds. And to my mind, if you're undecided, and this is what the research indicates, that if you're undecided in October, you're a kind of a ignorant couch potato who doesn't even read newspapers. And those are the people that all the money pours in to influence at the last minute. Is it truly that bad?
It's worse. So the couch potatoes are uninvolved people who have lives outside of politics. I may be the junkie that should get a life, so I'm not sure who's normal or who isn't. But what I like about the undecideds, who may be the couch potatoes, is that they live normal lives and they vote for people who they trust. So they make character judgments first, as do most voters. They're not different than most voters. But they don't follow the party or the politics in a way that is for the game and for what I do, which is like an addiction. They follow it as to how it might impact their personal lives. And some of them vote and some of them don't, but they're undecided because they're not caught up in the ideology or the competition or the intensity of politics. So at the end of the day, going back through American history, Ian, we've had lots of voters who are not involved until they decide who's really going to help me in my life. And most times the American people have made the right decision. It's really by luck, or maybe it's by design, that in this election, Barack Obama hasn't closed the deal. The first time he's been over 50% in any of the Gallup poll, which is the most reliable poll. Every day you can get your fix by going on www.gallup.com. They call 1,500 people every day randomly across the country, plus minus 3%, and they add up the last 3 days, 4,500 voters, and then they drop the fourth day and add a new day, and you can track. Barack Obama hasn't been over 50%, except since the Democratic Convention, ever against Mitt Romney, who's one of the weakest Republican candidates in my memory. So there is a reason why those undecideds are asked, who are you going to vote for? And they probably voted for Obama 4 years ago. They're saying, I don't know today. And you're right, it's an absolute ridiculous fact that these hundreds of millions of dollars in about 10 states. I'm in finally a battleground area, because Virginia, God bless Virginia, lets me see how bad everything is, because I'm watching these horrible ads. But I think, Ian, at the end of the day, we may not give enough credit to these folks who are not as addicted as I am and are judging Obama and Romney. What are they saying that's meaningful to my life that's causing me to want to vote for them?
Right, but doesn't that get to one of the things that's unique about America, in as much as we treat our democracy, we punch a ticket for democracy every couple of years. We do it out of duty, like going to the dentist. We don't live and breathe politics around the year, and like, say, the Europeans do. In a social context, the first thing you discuss is politics. In Europe, the last thing you talk about in America is religion and politics. And it goes to what I was talking about earlier, the disillusionment amongst the young who thought in 2008, by punching their ticket for Obama, the miracle worker would deliver, and now they're disappointed. In the real world, you have to work politics 24 hours a day for the rest of your life, don't you? You can't just be a casual drive-by voter every 2 years.
Well, God help us if we really do have to do it 24 hours a day, because it's an illness.
It's raining, as I don't know what.
It's an illness.
So, do you agree that
I'll pass the baton to Michael.
No, look,
I don't think so.
I was a county chairman. I was a state chairman for Maryland and national chairman. So I've seen it at various levels and various levels of energy that comes with sort of the campaign mindset. Whether we like it or not, we are now in a yearly election cycle. Literally after November 6th, November 7th, the 2014 cycle begins. Those individuals who will have been elected to Congress on that Tuesday before will get into ready mode to start raising money for 2014 and planning and strategizing their reelection before they even get to take the oath of office. So we are already in that cycle of not just 24/7 news, but 24/7 politics. The difference between us and Europe in some respects is that we don't talk about it amongst each other. We just sit in front of our television and cuss it out at any given time, because we passive aggressively participate through the medium of TV. Mm-hmm. And so when we out and we're socializing, we don't necessarily want to engage in that because of, as we witnessed earlier this evening, passions tend to flare, and we are allowed to carry in this country in some states, so it can get a little bit dangerous if you're not careful. So there is that aspect of it. But I think when you really break it down, I rather like it, to be honest. Yes, the campaign ads are crazy, and it's a cycle that you kind of regret once you gin it up again. But I do like the idea, and I really do passionately encourage, particularly our Gen Xers and others, young folks out there, to get involved in this process, because these times are so critically important. And I took a lot of heat when I was chairman and I was doing a voter registration effort, and of course everybody expected me to go out there and, register Republican. And I just couldn't do it in good conscience because of what my mama taught me. It's like, all I was advocating was, look, get out and register and be a part of the solution. Don't be a silent participant or someone who's sitting on the sidelines. African Americans, when I go into African American communities, I know that if I got an audience of 100 African Americans, that 98% of them are going to probably vote Democrat if they registered or when they register. But my point is that, fine, take that step, participate in this process, because it's critically important. As I told my 24-year-old son, do not come to me and start about Obama or the winner of this election if you don't vote this November. In my household, you do not have bitching rights when you don't participate. All right? It just doesn't happen. I don't care where you are on the spectrum. My son has more of a libertarian bent. He's a big Ron Paul guy, and so forth, and that's fine. But my view of it is, you don't get to come up in my face and gripe about the process when you haven't gone out and cast a vote and actually staked your claim, because that's what the Constitution allows you to do. And I think the more we advocate that, despite the political process of TV ads and 24/7 commercials and the droning on by some of the politicians out there, that's really kind of to wear you down. You figured that out, right? That's just to get you so numb to the process, you're like, I don't want to do this anymore. Work your way through that, stay engaged, and listen to what these men and women who are running for office are saying, and weed out the crap from the truth and the facts, and get engaged and involved in this process, because if you don't, you're risking a lot, primarily the country's future. It's that simple for me.
There's an old story about the man who was born in Austria, grew up in Czechoslovakia, got married in Poland, and died in the Ukraine. And he never moved out of the house he was born in. Now, I tell that story because it's well known, but I haven't moved from where I was when I was in high school.
Right.
Which was a long time ago. But the Republican Party has gone to a different planet. And in college, I was known as a right-winger. But I have never voted for a Republican in the national election because these people are crazy. And I am a Vietnam veteran. I was raised an evangelical, but because of that, I believe that we have to take care of the poor and the helpless, because that's what Jesus ordered us to do. If we didn't do it just because he said, if you do it to one of the least of these, you've done it to me. Mm-hmm. Where did the Republicans not read that in their Bible?
Okay, well, let's get an answer, because we don't have a lot of time.
Very quickly, I totally identify with what you're saying, and as I noted a little bit earlier, the party that I joined at 17 is not necessarily the party that I get to play with every day today, and certainly it's not a party that I think a lot of 17 and 18-year-olds today would gravitate towards, based on what we've seen and heard so far, and it is troubling to me. I will just put it in a political context this way. I noticed the change going back to the 2000 election, when, as a strategy that was implemented to win that election, we sort of gravitated to this red state, blue state model, in which we started to pit one side against the other. If you lived in a red state, then you automatically fit a particular stereotype and you were of a particular point of view. Same if you were in a blue state. And once you sort of set up that kind of model and you begin to fill it in with all kinds of other stuff to sort of redefine the political landscape for the purposes of winning an election, you get to where we are today. you get to a party that Ronald Reagan himself could not win a Republican primary today. On 2 issues alone, immigration and taxes. You know, and neither could Clinton on the left. That's very true. And so that's where this model, you know, of the parties kind of moving away from, and it's not about necessarily moving away from the center, it's just moving away from the space where the American people are. You know, and it's, you know, because you get to define where that is on the political spectrum in any given cycle at any given time. And instead of our politics gravitating to where you are, what our politics is doing is telling you this is where you need to be. And if you're not here with us, then you're not with us. You are against us. That's not American. And so I totally get what you're saying. And so what I've committed myself to, and has been part of my journey, is to fight against that and to sort of stake the claim and say, look, Republicanism, that's why I call myself a Lincoln Republican. You know, I don't identify with a lot of the other brands that they put out there because that's not where our roots are. Our roots are exactly where you outline. What drew you to the party as a young man is where the Republican Party probably should be, because it had those principles haven't changed. Your vote makes a difference. I mean, please, that is one of the easiest canards and the easiest things for the politicians. I'm just, you know, to throw out there.
But that's a given. Your vote makes a difference. Your voice makes a difference.
Right.
We get that.
Right.
But now we're dealing with something much deeper.
So you got to go deeper.
Yeah. So what does that look like?
Well, you tell me. I mean, you seriously. I mean, you know, we have this mindset in that's sort of crept into politics that when I'm vote, I'm done. And that these guys kind of run amok for 2 or 4 years, and then 4 years or 2 years later, I come back and go, oh my God, what happened? And they're like, oh, there's nothing wrong here. Just keep moving along. There's all good. Don't worry. We got control here. There's nothing wrong here. And what I'm saying is, to your point, and I can hear in your voice that kind of like, I'd like to, but how do I do it? It's what I tried to do when I was chairman, and that was start by listening to what people were saying and then developing a strategy around that and making them a part of it, which is not easy. It is not easy because people sometimes can be lazy about their politics and they can be lazy about participation. And the parties don't necessarily want you to participate. They really don't at the end of the day. They just want you to show up and vote the right way. And what I'm saying to you is, because the stakes are so great right now, if you have a job, if you don't have a job, if you are a business owner or you're not a business owner, the stakes are so great that you have to force this agenda. You have to force this leadership, whether it's the Romney side or the Obama side, to get engaged and give you specifics and talk about that. And what I discovered, and I'll tell you in the question, the answer this way. I'll never forget my last meeting as chairman. I invited about 50 or so Tea Party activists from around the country, leaders, to come to Washington. Part of it was to thank them in their efforts to help us on the ground. And let me be clear about that. I know there's a lot of stuff out there about Tea Parties, but the Tea Party is less affiliated with the GOP than you think. And if you don't believe me, just ask Senator Lugar and ask Bob Bennett and a few others who've been ousted. They're not about the whole party thing as much as they are about some other stuff. But set that aside. I'm in the room with them, and I'll never forget, as we were breaking up the meeting, one of them took me by the arm and said, just remember, we gave you the power in Congress. We will take it back from you in 2 years if you don't get it right. And so that is truth speaking to power, all right? And my point is that what they're saying is that we have a lot, we're going to take the control. We're watching, we're listening, and we're taking the control through the ballot box, by organizing on the ground, by pulling the resources together that we need to target a candidate or target a party. Right now within the GOP, and this is going to be very interesting to watch, we've had a number of Tea Party's activists elected state chairman, national committee man, national committee woman. The other thing they told me was, that's our goal, is to take control of the party from within. So in other words, that's a strategy that this group has decided to implement. to make themselves relevant in the political marketplace. More broadly speaking, it applies as well, and that's what you have to do.
Could I also suggest that you run for office? I'm serious. I speak to high schools and I ask, how many of you all want to run for office and get into politics? After hearing people express, rightfully, understandably, disgust in the choices, so why vote? And I always end up saying, how many people here who don't like choices are thinking of running for office and getting into politics? And I get laughter, or most kids think that's the last thing I want to do. So then I always have my favorite punchline. So when it's time for you to complain about the people running your lives, who are you going to complain to? You've been sitting back letting the wrong people run your lives. Go run for office. So if you don't want to run for office, I would not recommend it. At least go knock on doors for a candidate that you like, because you can make a big difference, even one person.
And that's effectively what the Tea Party did. The Tea Party activists have done in various state and local organizations around the country was that very thing. What was it? Joe the plumber ran for office. It's on the ballot this fall. And so, to your point, Lanny, that's exactly what they are starting to do. The same can happen with the Occupy activists. So it doesn't matter where you line up.
It's a plague on both your houses,
right,
as far as the Occupy people are concerned.
Well,
Michael, thank
yes.
you. Could you clarify something that you began with, that you dismissed the notion of bipartisanship at the beginning,
Yeah.
but you talk about consensus.
Mm-hmm.
With consensus, don't you get to bipartisanship?
No, because consensus isn't about party labels. Bipartisanship is. Bipartisanship is about the partisan cooperating. And what I'm saying is, and what I'm talking about is about leadership, leaders, individuals cooperating towards a general strategy or solution that has nothing to do with your politics. Why does the Simpson-Bowles formulation work? Because that leadership got in that room and they set the partisanship aside that was outside the door. And when you hear people talk about Simpson-Bowles, they very rarely use the term bipartisan when they talk about it. It generally is the word consensus, because that's what it took to craft that legislation or that framework. And so it's a very different model that Washington doesn't like to use, except in those rare instances when their back is up against the wall and they absolutely have to do something. And then they kind of, put bipartisanship aside and they get in the room and they get it done. And my concern is that's the cliff. And, I want you to get in the room before you get to the cliff and go off of it. And so,
by the way, excuse me, Michael, but just to reinforce, Bob Bennett, when you're labeled bipartisan because of this
Right.
Tea Party movement, it's the end of your career, because your threat comes from the right wing of your party base. And in Utah, Bob Bennett was defeated by a very right-wing anti...
In a caucus, too.
And in a caucus. And Orrin Hatch, who I am a great admirer of, and actually helped, in his own way, Bill Clinton, in the worst time period of the impeachment, reached out, and we worked with Orrin Hatch. Told me a number of stories about his work with Ted Kennedy, his best friend in the United States Senate, Ted Kennedy. More left and more right you can't be than these two fellows. And when Bob Bennett was accused of working with Ron Wyden of Oregon on a health care bill that was all private market principles, Wyden got more hate mail than Bennett did, because Wyden was willing to work with Bennett on a market-based health care that would have insured about 90% of America and left the other 10% to be subsidized. Bennett was defeated, and Ron Wyden has been threatened very badly because he co-sponsored a bill with Paul Ryan to have Paul Ryan get out of the voucher idea for all Medicare and make at least a voucher an option. So when the Democrats talk about Ryan wanting to give everybody, get rid of Medicare and make it all vouchers, that's a lie, because Ron Wyden and Ryan got together. Ryan pulled off of his proposal for a voucher system, and now makes the vouchers an option. The guy that suffered worst is Ron Wyden, who was almost read out of the Democratic Party caucus in the United States Senate because he was working with Paul Ryan. So it's pretty nasty out there. And I would say if you look at what an Orrin Hatch and a Ted Kennedy were able to do in getting legislation passed, it's not about party labels. It's about two human beings who identified with each other's values and came at the same goal from different ideologies, and they were willing to work together, and that's what's missing in Washington today.
I understand exactly what you were just saying, and I agree with much of what you all started saying. You've spoken about the demise of analytic journalism. You've spoken about the lack of real value in governance in our leaders. And I think you've understated, however, the systemic incentives that are at work in giving us such poor choices to vote for. I mean, you know, we're talking about the influence of money, the impact of the lack of real analytic journalism, and the fact that back in the day when there was a Durskin or somebody else, you couldn't get reelected if you couldn't compromise. If you couldn't reach consensus, you weren't a governor, and therefore you couldn't get back into office again, because that's what people recognized was being a successful senator or congressman. Now the incentives are exactly the opposite.
That's
As you've
really
just
good.
said, if you compromise, you are thrown out of
true.
office. And it seems to me that there are systemic incentives that need to change. We don't seem to be talking about that. True, we can all vote as intelligently as we're allowed, given our choices, but nobody's going to get the support of a party if they're not meeting the litmus test you refuse to accept, because somebody else is now in that job who is ready to accept it. So what do we do about the incentives? The system is not operating to our benefit. We're not being given an opportunity to vote for people who are what we want them to be. How do we effect change like that, other than being extremists along the lines that I think the Tea Party is, who are rejecting compromise as a basis of what they think is essential in the political system? Those of us who believe compromise is essential, where do we go from here?
May I just respond by asking you to run for office, please? That's one of the best, most insightful
it's very
comments I've heard in a
insightful.
long time.
Very insightful.
I would also like to shake up,
Very insightful.
before we depart, and I'm the one worried about catching a plane, and my Eleanor Spector McManus, stand up, where are you? She's worried about me catching
Yeah,
it.
it's
So let me
quarter
shake
to.
up the Democrats in this room. We have just as much a problem in our party as the Republicans have with the Tea Party. Has anyone heard of Senator Blanche Lincoln recently? Well, she's not a senator anymore. And her voting record, she was the 60th vote on health care. She was a great progressive from Arkansas in the Bill Clinton, Dale Bumpers tradition of the Southern moderate, pro-civil rights, pro-choice, pro-everything that's a liberal. But she didn't want to go along with one issue called card check, which deprived people of the right to a secret vote because organized labor needed card checks in order to expand their numbers. And that was the debate. And there's arguments on both sides. She was defeated by a Democrat running against her in a primary funded for $10 million by organized labor, and I'm a pro-labor Democrat. And we lost Blanche Lincoln. We have the same nihilists on the left in the Democratic Party who took, excuse me, sir, God out of the Democratic Party platform. It's not just the Republicans who have moved far to the right. If it weren't for Barack Obama, who should have been on top of that platform committee to never let it happen, who finally turned it around by a voice vote that wasn't nearly 2/3, who were the 40% of the people or half of that whole who said no when they wanted to put God back into the platform? For goodness sakes, these are people in the Democratic Party base who I get hate mail from and death threats from. It is mean on both sides. So I just don't want any sanctimony in this room among my fellow liberal Democrats talking about those terrible Tea Party people. Let's look at our own base, what they've done to a lot of great Democrats. We have the same problem on both sides. And don't be sanctimonious that it's just the Republicans who have the problem.
Well, I'm afraid these
See, I've
gentlemen
provoked
have
some
to
of
catch
you,
a
haven't I?
plane. So thank you both for
Thank
coming.
you.
It's been a very
Thank
enjoyable
you.
conversation.